Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us virtually. My name is Ahrens, and I am the curator and director of education at the Foxfire Museum, which is in Mountain City, Georgia, which is where we're at today. Our museum is comprised of over 20 historic log structures, and our museum interprets Appalachian history and culture. We're a lot different than most museums because we were actually built by high school students. So everything that's here today on our property was relocated here by high school students and community members. And that was an outgrowth of a project that started in 1966. Some of you may be familiar with the kind of iconic Foxfire books. That was a magazine, high school magazine project, sorry, that started in an English classroom here. The students who were really interested in their culture went out and started talking to their neighbors and elderly relatives. And in the 1960s, a lot of those people who were in their 80s and 90s had been born, in the previous century. So they were still living in this lifestyle that was reminiscent of earlier times. And the students got really interested in the things that these people were doing, whether it was building their houses from logs, growing their own food, or as we see today, cooking with fire on a wood stove or in a fireplace. And so they began a documentation process. They put those into magazine articles. Those magazine articles became the book series, and then they eventually put it into a physical space as well. So we have both collections from those interviews, so artifacts that they made, things like tools, maybe some toys that they used, those people that they were talking to used as children. And then all of those interviews went into our archive. So we have an oral history archive of almost 2,700 records from 1966 up until the present. So the very first Foxfire book was published in 1972, and it generated enough royalties that the students could purchase 100 acres of mountainside property, which is where we're at today. And again, this is where they brought all of those historic buildings, reconstructed them, and filled them with artifacts that they collected on those interviews. Some of the cabins here also serve as classrooms or studio spaces. So we do have weavers, blacksmiths, a flint knapper, a lot of demonstrator and craftspeople who come and work in these spaces on a regular basis. The cabin we're in today is our teaching classroom. This is a cabin from about the 1860s. It was donated to us by the Phillips family, and we have refinished it to be a teaching workshop for both herbalists and cooking classes, which is what I'm going to demonstrate today. So Foxfire, over the years, really captured a lot about foodways, whether it was growing your own food, different foods that people ate, different recipes. They actually published the Foxfire cookbook in the 1980s. We recently did a revised edition of that in 2019. I've got a copy I'll show you in just a little bit. But that's usually what we cook for when we do classes or demonstrations. But I like to teach wood stove cooking. That was what most people were still doing in the 60s and 70s when the Foxfire high school students went out to meet with them and interview them. And so I am working today on a 1931 home comfort wood stove. I like to call this the Cadillac of wood stoves. It's a lot fancier than what people in the mountains would have had. But most families by the 1930s and 1940s were starting to replace open hearth cooking with wood stoves. It did happen a little bit later here. You might see some as early as the 1900s and into the teens. But to buy a wood stove, you had to have cash, and not a lot of people had hard cash. So it took them a while to save up for those stoves. Most stoves would cost around $3 to $5, which was a lot of money for people in the mountains who lived self-sustainably. This would have certainly been a more expensive model that's got all the bells and whistles. This particular stove comes from a company that was based out of St. Louis, Missouri. They kind of shipped all across the nation. And they developed a special type of cast iron, which is what most wood cook stoves are made from. And it's called malleable cast iron. So it's thought to expand and contract a little easier, so it's not as prone to cracking as other cast iron might be. Cast iron is an unrefined metal. It's tough, it's durable, but it can't be susceptible to drastic temperature changes, or it can lead to cracking. So that's one unique thing about the stove. The other thing about the stove is it's really well insulated. So there's an oven inside the stove that I'll show you, and all the separate pieces are kind of encased in another layer of metal. That really helps keep a lot of heat in, which makes it more efficient to cook with. It has 6 eyes on top of the stove. So if we compare this to our stove at home, this would be your high heat. This would be your medium high. This might be medium at this point of the day. And this would be your low heat. And this space over here is actually a hot water reservoir, but it gets hot enough that you could theoretically keep something warm, kind of at a low, maybe even simmer over on top of the reservoir. And it would have a little knob here. It's unfortunately broken off, but this is a door that opens up and you would fill it with water. So you would always have water right at the ready for washing dishes, or if you need to throw some more water in the pot. I'm going to grab my tool here. This is a lid lifter. The number one thing I tell people when they come in here is that everything is hot. And we all make the mistake that, we're used to kind of leaning up against our stoves or whatever at home. You don't want to do that here. Luckily, we got a little guard in case you forget. You won't be leaning right on the stove. But it is very, very hot and very easy to burn yourself. We all have good stories from cooking on a wood stove. But the eyes are actually removable. And the eyes allow us to look directly into the stove. And the one back here on the far back of the stove is actually graduated. So if we look a little bit closer, we might be able to see that we've got this smaller size right here, and then there's a larger ring back there. Those 2 eyes are directly over the firebox. The firebox is where we build our fire, and this is the only thing that is heating the stove. And just to give you a sense of how hot this is, our oven is about 500 degrees right now, so it gets really roasty and toasty in here. But in here, we've got our wood, and this is where you build the fire and keep the fire going all day. So it takes constant attention, especially when you're first getting it started. So it's kind of died down a bit, but I put in a piece of hardwood right before we started this so that the stove would kind of stay warm and at an even temperature while we talk. Now, if you want a nice spike in heat, you are going to take small pieces of dry, really dry wood and put them in there to spike up the heat. These are called feeder sticks. You can also control the airflow. So we've got a damper right here. I can open it if I need more air circulation, or I can close it, which I'm going to do now if I want to retain that heat or let it cool down. I've got another damper back here. This is going to open the draft to the stovepipe. And if I pull it forward, it'll close it off a bit. The reason I close it off is it's going to start circulating more of the heat around my oven. Again, this is a very fancy oven. We have a temperature gauge on the front. We've got a really nice little oven handle. And we've actually put a thermometer in there so that we can continue to check the temperature. I have had a pan in the oven to get us ready to make some cornbread, and it has some lard in it, and as you can see, it is smoking quite hot, so the oven is doing real well right now. The other 2 pieces down here at the bottom of the stove, we've got a warming drawer. You might also consider this like your broiler. People would also store things down there, like you might in your current oven. And then this right here is our ash box. And if I pull this out, there are actually live ashes in there, so you never want to dump this until your stove is completely cold. You can start a forest fire. But it's got a little handle on it that I could take that entirely out, carry it far away from the house, and dump it wherever I needed to. So while our lard is hot, we're going to pause for a minute. I'm going to come over to my table and show you all how I make cornbread. And then we're going to put it in the oven, and we'll come back and show you a few more features on the stove and take some questions. All right, so very carefully moving this over because that pan is very hot. I'm actually going to grab a handle protector for my cast iron skillet. This is by Lodge. These are really handy. They come in both leather and silicone. So if you're a cast iron cooker and you are like me and you tend to forget that the handle gets hot, I definitely recommend it. They're useful when you're working on them. And you can actually use any pot on a wood stove, just like you would at home. I would compare it most to a gas range. So we tend to use cast iron because it's a better conductor of heat. And I truly think it makes a difference in the way that food is cooked, but you could use a stainless steel skillet, you could use a nonstick skillet. We have like a tin coffee pot that we use at times, or a kettle, anything like that. You can put on the stove as long as it's approved for your stove at home. It's the same sense of getting that heat. So I have my cornmeal here mixed up with some flour. Again, we have a cookbook from Foxfire, and not only does it have all of these great recipes in it, it's got stories that go along with it. So if you know anything about a Foxfire book, you know that all of the information, again, comes from first-person interviews that are directly transcribed and printed in the Foxfire book, and the cookbook is no exception. So instead of reading, you need half a pound of ramps and 3 tablespoons of butter. You're not going to find many of those type of recipes in this book. Instead, you're going to read excerpts from interviews like this one with Leslie Connor that says, wash them clean, cut them up fine, just like you would onions, put them in some grease, salt them, and fry them. When they get about done, break you 2 or 3 eggs in them and scramble them. I like them, but they'll knock you down. You can smell them in the house for weeks. Vineyard's got about 15 quarts of ramps out there in the freezer now. And then they follow with an interview with her husband, and just pulled out this one line from her husband Vineyard that says, every time I get sick, I always eat them. So I guess if you're sick, you might want to try ramps. They might clear your sinuses up. So just an example of the kind of stuff you're going to find in the Foxfire cookbook, which we just absolutely love. And it's more akin to sitting down with a family member or a close friend and learning to cook from them rather than cooking from a traditional cookbook. So anyway, that is where this cornbread recipe comes from. I throw in my own changes. I like to mix the type of corn flours that I use. So you can just use yellow cornmeal, but I actually throw in half yellow cornmeal and half masa flour. And masa is a white flour from corn. And it's actually more nutritious. It's what you would use if you were making tamales or tortillas. And it goes through a process called nixtamalization, which actually extracts, or not extracts, it breaks down the barriers that keep our bodies from being able to fully access the nutrient in corn. And that's a process that actually comes to us from indigenous peoples. So this is something that European settlers would have learned from the Cherokee in this region. So it's a really important part of getting the nutrients that you need from your food. And again, that was something that was done long before the Europeans arrived. So to my cornmeal mixture, I'm adding 2 cups of buttermilk. People in the mountains, they had cows, but they weren't for beef. They were dairy cows. It was really important that they got extra nutrients from milk, cheeses, and butters. Churning was an important part of daily life, or at least weekly, here in the mountains. There's a lot of stories from children of getting in trouble because they broke the cream when their moms let it set back so that they could skim the cream off to make their butter. Well, the kids would always want to get in the churn to get a little dipper of milk, and that would break the cream, and the mom wouldn't be able to skim that off for butter, and that would set them back the entire, week or a couple of days. So buttermilk is the byproduct of when you churn or beat cream into butter. And you can do this at home in a stand mixer. You can take just a little pint of cream if you want, throw it in your stand mixer, put a towel around your stand mixer because it splatters really bad, turn it on high, and you're just going to whip it past the stage of making whipped cream. So you'll just beat it and beat it and beat it until it breaks, is what they call it. And you'll see it. It'll immediately clump up, the fat molecules will clump up, and it'll expel the rest of this liquid, and that is the buttermilk. And never throw that away because it's delicious. If you don't have buttermilk, you can make a really easy substitute by taking your milk and throwing in a tablespoon of acid. So vinegar or lemon juice is another one that you can use. And you just want to let it sit for about 10 minutes or so. And the reason that you need the acid in there is it reacts with the baking powder. That's what gives it the rise. So I'm going to go and put this in. I'm also going to crack 1 egg. And then I'm going to fold this in. And the way I make it, it's a very dry mixture because my fat is in the pan. Now, like I said, I had lard in here. I put a 1/4 cup of lard. You could just as easily use a vegetarian substitute. I would recommend something like Crisco. I know it's not necessarily the healthiest, but it has a higher smoking point than butter, so you're going to be able to get it a lot hotter. Now, some people will pour the fat back into their batter, but I'm actually going to do the opposite. I'm going to leave the fat in the pan, and I'm going to pour my well-mixed corn mixture into my pan. And if you pull it right out of the oven, you're going to get this really satisfying sizzle. Mine's been sitting in there a bit, so it's cooled down just a slight. And then I'm just going to swirl in that fat over the top of my cornbread. And this is going to give what I like to call little grease canyons in your cornbread. You can make cornbread any way you want. It's really good if you throw in some jalapenos or some cheese. You can sprinkle some sea salt on top of it, but it's going to just swirl in really nicely. And then I'm going to carry this over to my oven and stick it in for about 30 or 40 minutes. Now, when you're cooking in when you're cooking in a wood stove, you always want to remember that your heat is coming from one place. So my heat is over here where my firebox is, which means that there's one side of my cornbread that's going to cook unevenly. So you do want to make sure you're rotating it, probably more frequently than you would at home, but you want to be careful to keep in mind that every time you open the oven, you're losing heat. So my oven's actually already gone down, which is good. I want it to cool off a bit. It was a little hot. But every time I open that door, I'm gonna lose more and more heat. So you either need to add more wood as you do that, get some of those feeder sticks that I mentioned in there. When you're cooking for longer periods, like especially when you're baking something that's going to take more than 15 or 20 minutes, you want to add hardwoods. Those are going to burn at a slower rate. So that's why I put locust in right before we began, because that's a really dense wood that's going to keep a more even heat throughout the oven. So that is pretty much the basics of cooking with a wood stove. It's really not that much different from cooking at home. And when we teach classes, we try to focus on getting the students comfortable just with cooking. We don't have them handle the fire much unless they're specifically interested in it, because it can be really daunting thinking about cooking with fire and cooking with different types of metal. So, it's good to get people adjusted and to know that it's really not that much different if you know how to work with heat. And again, cast iron does conduct heat differently. So you can practice that at home on a stove. You can use a cast iron skillet in your oven at home. You can use a cast iron skillet on your stovetop as long as it's not glass. And it's good to get to know how to work with that, because cast iron, the way that it holds heat, can really alter how you cook with it. But it does produce a better flavor, we think. So, but at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over and see if we have any questions or if there's any particular things y'all are interested in. I'd be happy to chat about the stove or Foxfire in general, whatever you guys are interested in.
Yeah. So, Cami, we had a question about what's the most challenging part of cooking in this method?
Maintaining your heat, knowing the temperature. And I think for me, at least, it's still different every time I cook with it, no matter how much I think I've got it. Like I was cooking this morning and getting the stove heated up, and the top was really nice and hot, right where I wanted it, but my oven was still like 200 or 250. So knowing how to manage the airflow and the type of wood that you're using and size of wood to get temperature where you need it is really difficult. So like hitting a temperature target is really challenging, but it's also a really good experience to cook on this because it teaches you more about intuition. So I have discovered that by cooking on this stove, I don't necessarily need to be at the temperature that my recipes say. I can get a really good sense of how that heat is going to affect what I'm cooking. It also teaches you a lot about patience. You have to be very present because you're constantly checking the fire, seeing if it needs more wood. You're constantly going out to get more wood. You're constantly checking your food. So it does, it's not a set it and forget it thing like you do at home sometimes. You really have to be present, which is a really great experience, especially if you're with other people. It really changes cooking and the sense of community you get from that.
Someone asked what your favorite like item or dish to cook is in this method.
We really like to cook cornbread because it doesn't taste like normal cornbread when you cook it on the wood stove. But I think the most delicious thing I've made on this stove is roasted chicken. So for our classes, we've been doing a type of roasted chicken that's called spatchcock, and it's where you like lay it out flat, and it's like the best, most juiciest chicken I've ever had in my life. So that's probably the most delicious thing we've made. But we make a lot of cornbread here. Sometimes I have an older gentleman who comes and demonstrates with me, and he brings a lot of foods that he's raised and harvested from seeds passed down through generations in his family. So that's always really special too when he brings a particular type of beans or some of his own cornmeal. We make a lot of good things. Fire here. Any other questions?
Yeah, so can you describe like the taste difference between dishes prepared on that stove and then like a more conventional oven?
Yeah, it's interesting. You think that you would get like a lot of smoky flavor, but you don't. But I think there is like a little subtleness of the flavor that kind of gets in the food, but it doesn't taste like everything's smoked. It doesn't taste like if you were cooking over an open fire. The other difference, I think, is time. I think our ovens at home, because we can get them to a particular temperature, that things maybe cook a little bit faster. And I think when you slow down the cooking, it brings out more of the flavors. Kind of if you think about if you leave something to like marinate overnight, or there are some dishes that are better the second day, like soups and chilies. Those flavors have more time to meld together. And I think that's akin to what happens on the stove. And certainly when we're cooking things like cornbread or biscuits, they seem to get more golden around the edges. I actually overcooked some biscuits earlier, but you can see that they're like really brown, and let me bring one over. So, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to get an even bake. We can get these close, but you do pretty good. You can see how golden they are on top, and they just get really crispy on the outside without the inside getting quite as dried out. So I'm not sure the exact science behind it, but that's the best I can describe it.
No, thank you. I was going to ask, like, where can people go to find more info on what you all do and like your classes and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. All of our information is available on our website. It's www.foxfire.org. We have lots of things you can check out from our classes that are in person. We have a lot of virtual and digital resources that became available both before and during COVID. We have a monthly podcast. If you're interested in listening to some of the archival audio that's featured in the Foxfire books, that is released on our podcast. And that is It Still Lives. You can find that on our website. You can find that on any platform that you get podcasts from, Stitcher, iTunes, all of that. And then we also have a YouTube channel that has some videos and virtual cooking classes that we've done previously. So that, again, is just the Foxfire Museum. So.
Thanks. I had one more question and it just, oh yeah. So since this is definitely a food festival, do y'all have like cookbooks that you've ever done or put together that are for sale?
Yeah, we have. So this cookbook that I mentioned, the Foxfire Book of Appalachian Cookery, is our primary cookbook. This was originally published in the 1980s, and then we did a revision with some help from Chef Sean Brock, who is a really well-known Appalachian chef. And it's for sale on our website and in our gift shop, or really any bookstore you can find it in. And then we also have some other books that have been published through the years. The Foxfire book series, there are a few that deal with different recipes and cooking. There's certainly a lot of Foxfire books that talk about wild foods. So Appalachian Foodways are, again, really rooted in place and depend heavily on foods that you can forage, or foods that you can grow in your backyard. So we do have, I think it's Foxfire 11 has a really great chapter on both gardening and harvesting wild foods and their uses. So they can be used for both foods and medicine. In spring, whoops, sorry about that, wind came through. But both spring and summer are really wonderful times to forage for food. We get a lot of spring greens that come in that were important parts of Foodways here. So things like sochan and ramps. And then in the summer, obviously the berries. And the berries actually were predominantly used in winemaking, and wine was mostly used for medicinal purposes. So again, looking at how people interacted with place and used those, the resources around them for both food and medicine. And that can be found in the Foxfire Book of Winemaking, which is available on our website as well.
You may have mentioned this, and sorry if you did and I missed it, but what's the date of the cabin or house you're in?
Yeah, it's from the 1860s. I don't know the exact year, but we know it's about that time. This cabin is unique because it actually has two fireplaces. Most homes, or most cabins that we have, and most homes in the region only had one downstairs. But there's actually a second fireplace upstairs. So there is a loft above us. Traditionally, lofts are where children would have slept. We use ours for storage right now, but we hope to have it kind of as a workshop space for herbalists. The cabin is relatively small, but it would have been fairly typical for the time period. Most homes were one room, and they would have had the downstairs set up mostly as a sleeping space, with some room for cooking over the open hearth. And then as generations went on and the families expanded, they would build additions onto the home. So they might build another log addition, or later they might build a box house or timber frame, and slowly expand out. And usually the first thing that they did was enclose their back porch. And that happened when they bought a wood stove. So instead of bringing the wood stove inside the house, it would go onto the porch, and then they would close the porch in and then have kind of an adjoining kitchen. So this setup is not typical of what a home would have looked like. It's functional for us for a workshop space, but this, would have normally been actually outside. And the homes here were mainly made from large poplar logs. You do see other types of logs, but I think most of the structures we have are hand-hewn poplar. They're joined at the corners by what's called a half dovetail notch. And that's a really specific style of notch that would have been common in this region, predominantly because of the wet weather that we have. That type of notch allows for more drainage. So just a little interesting tidbits about the architecture here. So, and we're gonna take 1 second to check this cornbread. So it's looking good, but it's not quite done. So I'm gonna go ahead and rotate it, but it's looking really nice. And I'm also gonna take a second to check our fire. We've got our logs burning here. We got some holes that are really nice. So since I got the temperature where I wanted at, and we're about wrapping up here, I'm gonna go ahead and close my damper. I had opened it to get more airflow, but again, that'll help maintain the heat, but also encourage it to slowly die down. And I think I forgot to mention these two doors up here. These are actually warmers, and they are quite warm. And this is where, if you are like us and you make more biscuits than you can eat in one morning, you can put them right in there, keep them warm until lunch. Or if you made something that got done before something else, which I am always doing at home, then you could stick those up there as well. And even the top right here would be a really nice warm space. And that is, again, just another feature that most wood stoves wouldn't have had, the really basic one. But this one does. We're really grateful for. So yeah, we're doing that. Do you guys have any other questions or anything that you'd like me to touch on while we're waiting for our cornbread to finish up? Got just a few more.
No, I think that was it. I was going to say though that we have a cabin in Jonesboro, and yeah, it has 2 fireplaces as well. It has the lower one and the upper one. So
Yeah, it's really cool. And you know, we often, well, we could like the upstairs one, but we often don't need to if we're doing winter demonstrations in here, because between the stove and the open hearth, it gets quite toasty in here. So it's amazing how well insulated the cabins are. This one is actually has perma chinking in it. So the gray stuff on the wall right here, I don't know how well you can see that. This is actually like a cement mortar mixture that is a more permanent type of chinking. This is a clay mixture, and this is what would have traditionally been used on cabins. But a lot of people didn't keep up with chinking. It's very labor intensive and it takes a lot of maintenance work. So as people would collect scraps of wood and stuff, they would board over those gaps so that they didn't have to chink it as much. And then usually on top of that, you'll see in a lot of places, especially in the 30s and 40s, they would cover it with newspaper. That doubled both as, well, 3 things, I guess: insulation, decoration, and reading material. There are people who remember learning how to read by reading their walls. So they would always kind of strategically place certain articles and pictures on their walls, which is really interesting. But
well, thank you.
yeah. So we'll just check this one more time, see if it's about ready. Okay. All right. So you can see we have got this to a nice golden color. It's nice and crispy around the edges from where we poured it into the hot lard. And the way you can always check your cornbread, you can give it a little tap and make sure it's firm and bounces back, or you can get a knife and just stick it straight through. And if it comes out clean, it's ready. And cornbread's nice and hot, so we can eat it as soon as it's out of the pan. So let me grab my cutting board. Okay, and we're going to do our nice little trick so that we can see the iron pan perfect bottom. So you just want to turn it out. And you can see it's nice and dark and crispy. And we'll go ahead and cut into it, and it should get real nice and steamy for us. Let's show you all a piece here. So we've got plenty if you guys want a piece. Come on down. Right.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. I wish we could go over there and get a piece right now.
Well, we've got plenty to eat, so it's really nice.
Well, Cammie, thank you, and thank Foxfire for joining us for our first taste of Tennessee, and we really appreciate it and everything you all do.
Well, thank you so much. We're happy to be a part of it, and hopefully next time we can do better in person.
Yeah. So yeah, just pack the stove up and move it down here.
Put it on the back of the car. No worries.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Y'all have a wonderful day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.